A millionaire CEO came to pick up his suit. Then a little girl in cleaning gloves shattered his world with 6 words: I want to buy a dad. The dry cleaner on 4th Avenue was never a place Michael Brooks expected anything significant to happen. It was just a brief stop on his already packed schedule, a routine pickup between a boardroom presentation and a lunch meeting with investors. He entered the storefront without a second thought, focused on his phone, reviewing reports, and thinking through upcoming negotiations. The hum of machines, the smell of starch and detergent, the clipped voice of the receptionist greeting customers, none of it registered until he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. A tiny figure crouched near the corner of the floor, wearing a red sweater that looked slightly too big, blue jeans that were visibly faded at the knees, and bright yellow cleaning gloves that nearly swallowed her small hands. In one of those gloved hands, she clutched a white rag that she was using to scrub the tile floor with quiet determination. Her brows were furrowed. She didn't look like she was playing. Michael stopped mid-step, confused. At first, he assumed she must have wandered away from her parents. Maybe one of the staff had brought their child to work. But something about the way she moved, the steady rhythm of her scrubbing, the tight press of her lips felt practiced, not random. She wasn't pretending. She was working. After a moment's hesitation, he approached and crouched beside her. He didn't want to startle her, so he spoke gently. Hey, sweetheart, are you lost? The girl glanced up at him. Her eyes were brown, deep, and serious in a way that startled him. There was no fear there, just a kind of tired patience. No, she said softly, I came to work. Michael blinked, thrown off by the calm, matter-of-fact tone in her voice. Work? He echoed, more to himself than her. She nodded and went back to wiping the floor. I'm helping. They said I could. I'm earning money. His heart pulled in a strange direction, an unfamiliar ache beneath the usual rhythm of ambition and power. Why do you want to earn money? He asked, unsure what answer he expected. The girl paused, sat back on her heels, and looked at him again. This time her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. So I can buy my dad back. Michael was stunned. The sentence didn't make sense, not in any logical adult way, but the way she said it, the sincerity behind it, made his chest tighten. Before he could respond, one of the staff hurried over a young woman with a nervous smile. I'm so sorry, she said quickly. She's not supposed to be scrubbing the floors. She just shows up sometimes and insists on helping. Michael rose to his feet, still watching the little girl, who had already turned back to her work. She said she's earning money to buy her father. The woman hesitated, her eyes softening. Her name's Lily. Her mother is really sick. The dad ran off months ago, took all their money and disappeared. The girl doesn't know that, though. She thinks he was taken or something, that she can earn money and get him back. Michael stared at Lily. She wasn't pretending to understand the world. She had created a version of it that made sense to her. In her mind, things weren't broken. They were simply expensive, and love fatherhood was something that could be earned if she worked hard enough. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know why it hit him so hard. Maybe because he knew all too well what it meant to be abandoned as a child, or maybe because in all his years of success and strategy, nothing had ever made him feel more powerless than this little girl trying to mop away her heartbreak. He picked up his suit in silence, but before leaving, he turned back once more. Lily was still on the floor, focused, methodical. Michael walked out of the dry cleaner that day with a perfectly pressed suit and a question he couldn't shake. What kind of world forces a child to believe that love needs to be bought? Michael didn't sleep well that night. The image of the little girl on the floor of the dry cleaner kept looping in his mind, stubborn and vivid. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Like it was obvious, like it was simple truth. I want to earn money so I can buy my dad. No hesitation, no drama. Just quiet certainty, the kind that lingered long after you heard it. In his world of business acquisitions and negotiations, that phrase was more haunting than any hostile takeover or market crash. By morning, he had made up his mind. He wasn't going to just let this go. It wasn't like him to get involved in personal matters. He was known for keeping everything clean and professional, emotions strictly out of the equation, but this wasn't something he could file away. He needed answers. He needed to understand who this girl was, where she came from, and what circumstances had forced her to believe she needed to work just to earn her father back. He canceled his morning meeting and returned to the dry cleaner, not in his usual press suit, but in jeans and a simple button-down shirt. The receptionist recognized him immediately, looking surprised and a little nervous. Before she could even ask what he needed, he said, "Is Lily here?" She hesitated, glanced toward the back, then motioned for him to follow. They walked through a narrow hallway into a small break room where Lily sat at a round table, swinging her feet as she munched on crackers from a plastic container. She looked up and blinked, clearly recognizing him. Her posture stiffened, but she didn't say anything. "Hi," Michael said softly, crouching down again to meet her eye level. "Remember me?" She nodded slowly, her hand still inside the container. "I wanted to talk to your mom," he said. "Is she nearby?" Lily shook her head. "She's at home. She doesn't come out much anymore." "Is she okay?" The little girl shrugged, a gesture that carried far too much resignation for a 5-year-old. "She gets tired. She says it's her bones." Michael felt something twist inside him. He thanked the staff, got the address, and left the shop with a strange feeling in his chest: urgency, concern, and something dangerously close to fear. The apartment was in a rundown building on the edge of town. Cracked steps led up to a door with peeling paint. When he knocked, it took a long time before he heard movement. Finally, the door opened a few inches and a pale, thin woman stood behind it. Her skin was grayish and her hair was pulled into a loose bun that hadn't been combed in a while. She looked exhausted, but not startled, more like she had been expecting something bad and was relieved it hadn't come yet. "I'm sorry to bother you," Michael said, keeping his voice low. "My name is Michael Brooks. I met your daughter yesterday." She leaned her forehead against the edge of the doorframe, eyes fluttering shut for a moment before opening again. "She didn't do anything wrong, did she?" "No," he said quickly. "No, not at all. She's incredible. She told me something yesterday that caught me off guard." Sarah Holland opened the door a little more. "Come in," she said, almost reluctantly, as if she didn't want to but felt too tired to argue. The apartment was clean but bare. A second-hand couch, a folding table, 2 chairs, and a small bookshelf with a few children's books. He noticed an oxygen tank in the corner and a stack of hospital bills on the kitchen counter. "She thinks she needs to buy her dad," Michael said, once they were both seated. Sarah gave a dry, brittle laugh. "Of course she does. I didn't tell her the truth." "Why?" Her voice cracked a little when she answered, "Because I didn't want to be the one who broke her heart. He left us. Took everything we had, my savings, her college fund, even the cash from the emergency envelope. He didn't say goodbye. He just disappeared. I thought maybe if I told her he'd been taken or trapped, she wouldn't feel so rejected. I didn't expect her to take it literally." Michael looked around the room again, the worn edges of the furniture, the thinness of the woman in front of him, the way her hands trembled just slightly. "And you? What's your condition?" She hesitated before answering. "Stage 3 lymphoma. It's aggressive. I've been doing chemo off and on, but I can't afford regular treatments. I'm trying. I'm fighting. But some days I'm just trying to get through until she's asleep." The words hung in the air like smoke. Michael had sat in meetings with billion-dollar investors, faced down corporate attacks, and fired executives without blinking. But nothing in his career had ever prepared him for this. A dying mother, a child scrubbing floors for imaginary ransom, and a home stitched together with hope and paper-thin strength. He took a slow breath. "Let me help you." Sarah's expression hardened. "With respect, we've had people offer help before. Most of them meant well, but they didn't stay. They saw a sick woman and a sad kid and figured it'd feel good to pay a bill or drop off groceries. Then they disappeared." "I'm not one of them," he said. "You're a CEO," she said with a tired smile. "You're used to fixing things with money. I'm also a man who knows what it's like to grow up without a father and think it's your fault," he replied. "Please, let me do something." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "Then start by being someone she doesn't have to buy." And with that, the foundation of everything Michael thought he knew about value and worth quietly shifted. He wasn't just a man offering a donation or trying to make himself feel noble. He was standing on the edge of something much more human, much more real. Something he didn't fully understand yet, but something he couldn't walk away from. Michael returned to his office that afternoon, but nothing about the sterile glass walls or the curated silence of his executive floor felt the same. The numbers on his computer screen swam in and out of focus, and the meetings he took part in all sounded distant, as though he were watching someone else's life play out in a room where he no longer belonged. Every sharp edge of corporate strategy, every bullet point on his quarterly projections felt trivial compared to the small girl wiping the floor with trembling hands and the woman too weak to stand for more than a few minutes. They had no leverage, no agenda, no negotiation, and yet their presence occupied more space in his mind than any investor ever had. He sat behind his desk late into the evening, long after most of his staff had left for the day. At one point, he pulled up Lily's name from the intake sheet at the dry cleaner, and his assistant, curious, asked who she was. Michael didn't offer a full explanation. He simply said, "Someone I'm helping," and left it at that. He was already formulating a plan, not just charity, but structure, long-term support. He didn't want to be a temporary handout. He wanted to build something that wouldn't disappear when the news cycle moved on or when the moment lost its shock value. The next day, he returned to Sarah and Lily's apartment, this time with groceries, medicine, and a contact sheet for one of the best oncologists in the city. Sarah looked at the bags like they were dangerous. She didn't say thank you immediately. She just quietly began unpacking them, her movements slow but purposeful. Michael watched her hands tremble slightly as she placed a jar of peanut butter into the cupboard and realized just how much strength she used up on simple acts. "I don't know how long I have," she said after a while, not looking at him. "But I'm not giving up. Lily doesn't need pity. She needs someone to tell her she's not wrong for hoping." Michael nodded, unsure how to respond to something so honest. He glanced down the hallway toward Lily's room and asked softly, "Would you be okay if I spent some time with her? I think she has questions, and maybe I could answer some." Sarah hesitated, then gave a tired nod. "Just be careful what you promise." He found Lily on the floor in her bedroom, surrounded by a handful of toys that looked like they'd been handed down more than once. She was coloring a sheet of paper with markers that had mostly dried out, but she still worked with complete focus. When she saw him in the doorway, she gave a small wave, not quite a smile, but not fear either. He sat down cross-legged a few feet away. "What you drawing?" he asked. "A house," she said, "but it's not ours." "Whose it?" "I don't know yet," she replied. "I think it's the one I'll live in when I get my dad back." Michael's chest tightened. He leaned slightly forward. "Lily, can I tell you something about dads?" She nodded. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "a dad isn't someone you have to buy. Sometimes he's someone who chooses to be there because he wants to." She looked at him seriously, but mine left. I know, he said gently. And I don't think that was your fault. Not even a little. She looked down at her hands, twisting a marker cap between her fingers. Mama says he had to go. She told me that too, he admitted. But I also think she wanted to protect you from something sad. Lily didn't cry. Instead, she asked, "Are you going to disappear too?" Michael was stunned by the question, but he didn't show it. "No," he said, "I won't disappear. I don't always have the right answers, and I won't always do everything perfectly, but I promise I will stay." She stared at him for a long time, and then, as if testing the strength of his words, leaned against him slightly. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't even touch. Just a small tilt of her weight toward where he sat, the kind of gesture children make when they want to believe in something, but don't know if they're allowed to yet. Michael didn't move. He stayed there with her for as long as she needed, listening as she continued to color and talk about the rooms in the house she was drawing, one for her, one for Mama, and one for someone who could maybe pay her new dad if they could afford him. It was the moment he realized that this wasn't just about helping a stranger. This was about rewriting something broken, about showing a little girl that love didn't have to be earned, and that fathers weren't things to be bought. They were people who stayed. Over the next few weeks, Michael's life began to change in ways that didn't make headlines or appear on any quarterly report, but were more profound than any professional milestone he had ever achieved. His routine, once dictated by early morning meetings and late night calls with global investors, slowly made room for visits to a modest apartment complex on the east side of town. Each visit began with groceries and small essentials, vitamins, books, new school supplies, but over time, those visits became less about what he brought and more about simply showing up. Lily, cautious at first, began waiting for him at the window. She never said so, never asked when he was coming. But Michael noticed how her face lit up when his car pulled into the lot. Her wariness was still there, buried beneath the surface, but it was beginning to give way to something else, curiosity, maybe even trust. She'd ask more questions now, not just about the business world he lived in, but about the world she barely understood. She wanted to know how skyscrapers were built, how people decided who was in charge, why some children had fathers and others didn't. The kinds of questions that were too big for her small voice, but somehow always found their way into their conversations. Sarah, meanwhile, had begun to gain strength again. The treatments Michael arranged were working slowly, giving her back fragments of energy. She started sitting up longer, eating more, and even helping Lily with homework when she wasn't too fatigued. Her body was still frail, but her eyes carried a spark that hadn't been there when he first met her. One afternoon, as Michael helped her organize medical documents at the kitchen table, she looked up and said, "You've done more than I ever imagined anyone would." He shook his head. "I haven't done anything extraordinary. I just couldn't walk away." "You stayed," she said. "That's what made the difference." The simplicity of her words landed harder than he expected. For most of his life, staying had never been part of the equation. He built, scaled, launched, exited, but he rarely stayed. He moved fast, he moved forward, and emotional distance had always been a necessary discipline. But with Sarah and Lily, leaving had never even crossed his mind. As Lily grew more comfortable, she began spending a few afternoons a week at Michael's office. His staff, initially stunned, quickly adapted to her presence. She became something of an unofficial mascot, polite, observant, always scribbling in the small notebook he had given her on the first day. He set up a little desk for her beside his own, complete with colored pens and paper, and she decorated it with drawings of stick figure families, tall buildings, and smiling faces. More than once, she sat through board meetings, listening intently as if she were absorbing the language of business through osmosis. She never interrupted, never fidgeted. It was as though she instinctively knew the value of watching closely in a room where people didn't expect her to belong. One day, during a product strategy meeting, a junior manager suggested cutting costs by eliminating a small but socially impactful program Michael's company had been funding for underprivileged youth. Before Michael could say anything, Lily leaned toward him and whispered, "That sounds mean." He turned his head, stifling a smile, and replied under his breath, "You're not wrong." Later that day, as they walked to the parking garage, Lily asked, "Do I get paid for office work?" Michael chuckled. "What kind of salary are you expecting?" She thought for a moment, tapping her chin dramatically. "One hot chocolate per visit. And maybe one sticker." "Done," he said, holding out his hand to shake on it. In time, Michael began to notice something else, how his life outside of Sarah and Lily had shifted too. His colleagues were softer, more patient. His executive assistant had started leaving small notes of encouragement on his desk. People began opening up more, even in meetings. The culture of the office had changed, not by design, but by influence. Lily's quiet presence reminded them all that the world was bigger than numbers, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room carried the most weight. Still, there were challenges. One afternoon, Sarah called him in a panic. Lily had come home from school in tears after another child told her that she was weird for not having a dad. When Michael arrived, she was sitting in her room, curled up on the bed with her notebook clutched to her chest. He sat beside her and asked if she wanted to talk. At first, she shook her head, but then she whispered, "Maybe if I was smarter or nicer, he would have stayed." Michael felt a wave of anger rise not at her, but at the man who had planted that thought in her mind simply by leaving. He took a breath and said, "Lily, your dad didn't leave because of who you are. He left because of who he is. And you being smart and kind and brave, that's all you. That's what makes you amazing." She didn't respond right away, but eventually she rested her head on his arm. "Then how come you stayed?" He thought about that for a long moment. "Because someone like you deserves someone who doesn't leave." That night, after Sarah had gone to sleep, Michael sat in his car for a long time outside their building, staring at the dashboard, thinking about everything he had learned over the last month. He hadn't planned on this. He hadn't been looking for anyone to save. But somehow, by showing up, by staying, by listening, he had stumbled into something bigger than responsibility. He was becoming a part of their story. And that story was no longer just about survival. It was about rebuilding something no one could ever put a price on: a sense of safety, a second chance. A home.it was late October when the past came storming back in a way none of them were prepared for. The leaves had started turning, and Lily had picked a handful of them on the way home from school, pressing the brightest ones into a scrapbook Michael had bought her. Things had started to feel almost peaceful. Sarah was responding well to treatment. Lily was thriving at school, and Michael found himself thinking about them not just as two people he was helping, but as part of his own life now, something permanent, something he no longer imagined ending. But peace, as he was learning, was fragile. The first sign came in the form of a letter, an official-looking envelope addressed to Sarah that arrived in the mail on a rainy Thursday morning. At first, she assumed it was another hospital invoice or maybe a reminder about her treatment schedule. But when she opened it, her hands began to shake. The letter was from a lawyer. Her ex-husband, Thomas, had resurfaced and was seeking legal acknowledgement of his parental rights. He claimed he wanted to be part of Lily's life again. He even had the audacity to hint at financial compensation for giving up those rights, implying that he would only back off if there was something in it for him. Michael arrived that evening to find Sarah pale and silent, the letter unfolded on the kitchen table. He read it once, then twice, his face darkening with every word. Lily was in the other room, singing softly to herself while drawing, completely unaware of the storm that had just arrived. Sarah looked up at Michael and whispered, "He's coming back, not for her, for money. He's not even hiding it." Michael clenched his jaw, trying to steady his voice. "He has no claim. He abandoned both of you. And we have records, witness statements, hospital reports. If he thinks he can scare you into paying him off, he's wrong. But Sarah wasn't scared of the legal battle. She was scared of what it would do to Lily. She still talks about him like he's a superhero she lost. I never corrected her. I let her believe he was taken, not that he ran. You did that to protect her, Michael said. And now it might destroy her, she whispered. The days that followed were filled with lawyer consultations, paperwork, and emotional minefields. Michael hired his firm's best legal counsel to handle the case. He insisted on covering every fee and ensured they filed a formal petition to terminate Thomas's rights on the grounds of abandonment, financial fraud, and emotional negligence. It wasn't just about protecting Sarah anymore. It was about protecting Lily from a man who had never loved her the way she deserved to be loved. The hardest part was deciding when and how to tell Lily. They couldn't keep the truth hidden forever. Not with court dates approaching, not with the chance that Thomas might try to contact her directly. One evening, as they sat on the floor playing a board game, Sarah gently put a hand on her daughter's shoulder and said, "Sweetheart, we need to talk about something." Lily looked up immediately, alert. Did I do something wrong? No, Sarah said quickly. This isn't your fault. It's about your dad. Lily's expression changed. She didn't smile, but her eyes filled with a cautious kind of hope. Is he coming back? Michael's heart broke at the question. Sarah looked at him, then back at Lily. We thought he might, but not for the reasons we hope. He's not coming to be your dad again. He's coming because he wants something. Something he shouldn't ask for. Lily blinked, trying to understand, like money. Yes, Sarah said, but more than that, he's trying to scare us. And we don't want him to hurt you or make you feel like you're not enough, because none of this is your fault. Lily didn't cry. She sat very still, processing. So he left because he didn't want to be my dad. Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Michael stepped in, gently taking Lily's hand. He left because he couldn't be the kind of dad you needed. That doesn't mean anything about you. It means everything about him. For a long moment, Lily said nothing. Then she whispered, "But I'm still worth loving, right?" Michael nodded immediately, his voice firm. You are worth loving every single day. And you are loved by your mom, by me, and by everyone who really sees you. In the weeks that followed, the court proceedings began. Thomas made an appearance, smug, careless, and full of empty charm. He spoke about Lily like a distant acquaintance, using her name as leverage, but showing no understanding of who she really was. He didn't know her favorite animal, didn't remember her birthday, and when asked by the judge what her middle name was, he hesitated. Michael, sitting beside Sarah in the courtroom, felt fury rise in his chest, but he kept calm for Lily's sake. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a tired expression, saw through Thomas quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Records showed years of abandonment, no child support, no contact, and theft from Sarah that had left her and her daughter on the edge of homelessness. The judge asked Sarah what outcome she was seeking, and she answered quietly, freedom for my daughter, from ever thinking he left because of her. That one sentence carried more weight than every legal document in the room. The judge ruled in Sarah's favor. Thomas's parental rights were officially terminated. He had no legal claim, no right to contact Lily again. When the gavel came down, there was no applause, no celebration, just the sound of breath being released in relief. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Lily held Michael's hand tightly. She didn't ask about the ruling. She simply said, "You stayed." He knelt beside her and said, "And I always will." And in that moment, he realized the truth. Staying wasn't something you promised once. It was something you chose over and over every day with every action. And He had no intention of stopping now. The weeks after the court ruling brought a different kind of quiet to Sarah and Lily's apartment. It wasn't the same tense silence that had once hovered in the corners of every room, the kind shaped by fear and uncertainty. Now it was the stillness of relief, of beginning to breathe again without looking over your shoulder. It was healing, subtle and slow, but real. Lily, though still processing everything in her own way, no longer asked questions about her father. The topic, once a source of daily curiosity, had faded from her conversations. She didn't bring him up at dinner or mention him when coloring pictures of families anymore. Instead, she started talking about the future, about school and our projects, and whether they could visit a zoo when spring came. It wasn't a rejection of the past. It was something better, a quiet choosing to move forward. Michael became even more involved in their lives, though not out of obligation. No one asked him to show up every Saturday morning with pancakes and a bag of groceries, or to help Lily with her spelling words in the evening, or to pick Sarah up from the clinic when she was too weak to drive. But he did it anyway, not because he wanted thanks, but because it felt like something he was always meant to do. His apartment, once meticulously organized and rarely lived in, now felt foreign to him. He spent most nights in Sarah's building, reading on the couch while Lily fell asleep to the sound of her mother's breathing down the hall. At the office, things had changed too. Michael was still the same sharp, strategic mind in boardrooms, still expected to make the hard calls. But people noticed the difference. He was more patient now. He remembered birthdays. He stopped to ask how people's kids were doing and listened to the answers. He spoke about long-term goals, not just in terms of growth and profit, but about legacy. He started asking questions that had nothing to do with margins and everything to do with impact. One afternoon, after a strategy meeting, his assistant gently knocked on his door. "Michael," she said, "there's a girl in reception asking for you." He looked up from his desk, already guessing who it was. Lily walked into the office with her backpack slightly askew, holding a hand-drawn card in both hands. It was folded unevenly and covered in glitter. She handed it to him without a word, then waited. He opened it carefully. Inside, in shaky handwriting, it read, "Thank you for staying. You're the dad I thought I had to buy, but you were free the whole time." Michael had never received anything in his life, no award, no paycheck, no bonus that carried the weight of that card. He set it on his desk like a priceless object and swallowed the lump in his throat before pulling her into a hug. Sarah, too, was different, stronger. The treatments were still hard, but she was no longer fragile in spirit. She had begun to write again, essays, stories, little reflections that she stored on her laptop but hadn't yet shared. Michael read one by accident, a file she'd left open when she asked him to help her with the tech issue. It was titled "The Man Who Didn't Leave." In it, she described a person who walked into her life uninvited with no plan to stay and chose to do so anyway. She wrote about how hope isn't loud or dramatic, it's quiet and consistent. It's someone showing up again and again and again. He didn't mention it to her, but later that night, when she looked tired and leaned against him on the couch, he said softly, "I'm not going anywhere, you know." "I know," she replied, and in her voice was something new, not just trust, but peace. The three of them began to move like a unit, not in grand declarations, but in small, unshakable ways. Sunday mornings belonged to pancake breakfasts and grocery lists. School nights included spelling quizzes and bedtime stories. Evenings were filled with slow, quiet moments, folding laundry together, watching movies with mismatched subtitles, falling asleep during thunderstorms with the windows cracked just slightly open. None of it was perfect. There were still hard days. Sarah still had treatments that knocked her down for days at a time. Lily still had nightmares. Michael still struggled to balance work with the pull of a life that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. But in the middle of all that, they had created something rare, stability that didn't come from money or power, but from the steady, unglamorous practice of being there for one another. And Michael, who had once believed that his legacy would be his business or his influence, started to understand something much more powerful. His real legacy wouldn't be what he built, but who he stood beside when everything else fell away. Winter settled over the city with a quiet persistence, coating rooftops with a thin layer of snow and filling the air with the kind of cold that demanded you pause before stepping outside. For most people, it was a season of holidays, warmth, and tradition. For Michael, Sarah, and Lily, it was the first season they would face together as something more than friends, more than people thrown together by circumstance. They weren't quite calling themselves a family, not out loud, but everything about their days spoke that word silently and clearly. Lily had grown taller in the months since Michael first met her, and her confidence had grown with her. She no longer hesitated before speaking in groups, no longer lowered her eyes when adults asked her questions. She had started referring to Michael as my person, a term she'd invented quietly one day at school when her teacher asked her to describe the most important adult in her life. He's not my dad, she had said matter-of-factly, but he's my person. When Michael heard the story later from Sarah, he smiled but said nothing. He didn't want to rush anything or define feelings that hadn't yet settled fully into place. But deep down, the words settled into him like roots. Sarah's health, though still delicate, had stabilized enough for her to resume some of her old hobbies. She began volunteering at a nearby community center a few afternoons a week, helping with tutoring and organizing reading sessions for kids who reminded her of Lily. She never mentioned it directly to Michael, but he noticed the way she smiled differently after those visits, like some part of her, long dormant, had remembered how to feel useful again. She still had moments when she struggled physically, when fatigue wrapped around her like a heavy coat, but those moments no longer defined her. They simply existed alongside all the others' moments of joy, of progress, of a slow and steady return to herself. Michael was learning too. Learning to be present in a way that didn't come with instructions or guarantees. He had mastered so many things in life: finance, leadership, crisis management, but this was something else entirely. There were no reports to measure success, no charts to track emotional growth. He learned through action, tying Lily's shoes before school, cooking dinner with Sarah even when neither of them had the energy, learning which days Sarah needed space and which days she needed quiet company. He learned how to sit in silence and let it be enough. But just as they began to find rhythm, life delivered another test, not a dramatic one, but the kind that quietly threatens everything you've built. Michael's board of directors called an emergency meeting. A merger offer had come in from a powerful international firm. It was aggressive, lucrative, and time-sensitive. The kind of deal that could push the company to the next level and remove Michael as CEO in the process. He spent hours poring over documents, projections, and risk assessments. Every part of his professional instincts screamed that this was the culmination of everything he had worked for. It was clean. It was logical. It was powerful. But in the middle of all the numbers, he kept thinking about the crayon drawings still taped to the inside of his office cabinet, the one Lily had labeled Our Life Plan. It had hearts, a house, and 3 stick figures holding hands. That night, Sarah found him on the balcony of her apartment, staring out over the snowy streets. "Big day?" she asked, stepping beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. He nodded. "They want to buy everything. I walk away with enough money to disappear into the world forever." She looked at him quiet for a long moment. "And is that what you want, to disappear?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't think I've ever really wanted money for the sake of money. I just never knew what else there was to want. And now? I want her to feel safe," he said. "I want you to feel strong. I want Sunday mornings and spelling tests and board games. I want to matter when no one's watching." Sarah's hand found his. "Then you already have everything they're offering to sell you." He made his decision the next day. He turned down the merger. His board didn't understand, and some investors threatened to walk. But Michael didn't flinch. He gave them his reasons calmly and clearly, and when he left that meeting, he felt more grounded than he ever had in a room full of money. That evening, as they sat around a tiny artificial Christmas tree Sarah had pulled out from storage, Lily handed Michael a small box wrapped in wrinkled tissue paper. Inside was a homemade paper medal, drawn in marker and stapled together with ribbon. It said, "Best man who stays." He looked up, his throat tight. "What's this for?" "For choosing us," Lily said, "even when you didn't have to." And for the first time in a long, long while, Michael didn't feel like a man who was helping a struggling family. He felt like a man who had finally found his own. Spring came quietly, slipping in between late snows and early blossoms, and with it came a kind of lightness none of them had expected. The cold, the fear, the uncertainty that had once filled every corner of Sarah's apartment had begun to melt, not all at once and not without effort, but steadily like the thawing ground outside. The days were longer now, the air warmer, and everything about their lives felt like it had finally begun to breathe. Sarah's health had improved. Her treatments had become less frequent, and her strength was slowly returning in noticeable ways. She started cooking again, experimenting with old recipes she'd nearly forgotten. She laughed more, read more, and even began outlining a children's book based loosely on Lily's drawings and stories. Her hair had started to grow back, short and soft, and she no longer avoided mirrors. There was a quiet pride in her now, not because the worst was over, but because she had survived it and still had the courage to look ahead. Lily had blossomed too. Her teacher sent home glowing notes about her reading progress and her leadership in class. She had started a little kindness club at school, helping kids who felt left out, and insisted on making care packages with Sarah for the children's ward at the hospital. But more than her accomplishments, it was her ease that marked the change. She no longer walked on eggshells. She didn't look for her father's shadow in crowds or ask impossible questions. Instead, she asked Michael to teach her how to type, how to make pancakes, and how to fold the corners of fitted sheets, a task he'd never mastered but pretended he had just for her amusement. Michael, for his part, no longer thought of Sarah and Lily as separate from his life. They weren't guests in his schedule. They were his schedule. He had moved most of his work to a remote structure, rebalanced leadership at his company, and hired a new operations director to handle the day-to-day. He still held the title of CEO, but he rarely sat in that corner office anymore. His days were measured differently now, not in earnings or acquisitions, but in breakfast made, homework checked, and stories read at bedtime. One bright Sunday morning in May, they packed a picnic and drove out to a quiet lake an hour outside the city. It was the first time in years that Sarah had been far from home without a doctor's note or medical necessity. They spread a blanket beneath a tree and unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and a homemade pie Lee had insisted on baking badly. The crust was too thick, the filling a little sour, but none of them cared. They ate every bite. After lunch, while Lily chased ducks near the water's edge, Sarah leaned against Michael and watched her daughter with a quiet smile. "You know," she said, "she used to believe she had to earn everything: love, attention, safety, even me. She used to ask what she could do to be worth keeping." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly. "She doesn't ask that anymore." "No," Sarah said. "Now she just assumes she's already worth it. That's you, Michael. You did that." He shook his head gently. "We all did it. Together." They were quiet for a while, the breeze shifting gently around them. Then Sarah reached into the picnic basket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I wasn't sure when to give you this," she said, "but now feels right." Michael took it carefully and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an adoption request signed by Sarah, requesting that Michael be granted legal guardianship of Lily. His eyes moved slowly across the words, then back to Sarah's face. She asked me to draw it up, she said softly. I told her it wasn't just a piece of paper. I told her it had to mean something real. And she said, it already does. I just want it to mean it to other people too. Michael's throat tightened. He looked out across the lake where Lily was waving at them from a log, her hair wild in the wind, her smile wide and fearless. He looked back at Sarah, who reached for his hand, her grip warm and steady. I'm not trying to replace anyone, he said finally. I just want her to know I'll always be here. She already knows, Sarah whispered. This is just the part where we say it out loud. The paperwork would take time. There would be meetings, background checks, formalities, but none of that mattered. Because in every way that counted, they were already a family. Not a perfect one, not one without history or scars, but a real one made not by blood or obligation, but by choice and by love that had been tested and proven again and again. That night, after they returned home, Lily climbed into Michael's lap and asked if she could call him Dad. She didn't look uncertain or nervous. She just asked like it was the most natural thing in the world. Michael smiled, his voice breaking just slightly. Yeah, I'd like that. She nodded once, satisfied, then leaned her head against his chest and whispered, Told you I didn't have to buy you. And in that moment, simple, small, perfect Michael knew he had finally become the man he had never dared to imagine he could be. A man who stayed. A man who chose. A man who loved and was loved back. A father. This story ends not with a grand twist or dramatic gesture, but with something far more powerful, quiet, chosen love. What makes it beautiful is how deeply human it is. A little girl wounded by abandonment learns that love doesn't have to be earned or bought. A mother, tired and sick, finds strength not just in survival, but in allowing someone else to stand beside her. And a man who had everything but connection discovers that the greatest success isn't building an empire, it's building a home. What resonates most is the idea that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to stay, who show up day after day, even when it's hard, even when there's nothing to gain, but the simple, priceless act of being there. This isn't just a story of rescue, it's a story of transformation for all three of them. And in that transformation, we're reminded that love doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in quietly, sets down roots, and stays for good.